Today I've been thinking a lot about perfectionism, which is something that I've struggled with myself quite a bit my entire life, and I certainly can't say that I have entirely mastered or even fully understood what's going on within my own perfectionism and those tendencies. I started thinking about it today in part because I'm beginning another semester with students, and I have them do these self-evaluations at the beginning where, among other things, I ask them about their own tendencies and what they think might interfere with them doing well in my classes. And there tend to be about four main things semester after semester that I see students bringing up, and they're not all about perfectionism, although some of them have some connections. They talk about time management skills, big problem. It was always a big problem for me as well. Writing abilities. They talk about procrastination, which is connected with time management, but is somewhat a bit different. And then I would say a good third of my students, maybe even half of them, depending on the class, bring up being perfectionists. And this sometimes ties together with procrastination and with other issues as well. So I want to talk about this, and I'm shooting this video in part for my students, but I think that this is useful to think about outside of just a strictly academic context, because it's a perennial problem that comes up over and over again in people's lives, academic lives, personal lives, our political engagements, many other things. I mean, it holds us back in many ways from things. So I want to talk about perfectionism in general. What does it mean to be a perfectionist? Well, if we want to answer that, we should think about, well, what does a perfectionist look like? And if you're a perfectionist, you can, look in the mirror. But it's not quite so easy, because one of the things that you notice about this tendency is it leads to, or it both leads to and it comes out of a lack of self-knowledge that comes not from any sort of deficit necessarily in the person, but from not paying attention to what's going on because you're so focused on other things instead. It's sort of like doing sleight of hand with yourself all the time and fooling yourself, where you're both the magician and the audience, and so you're taken in by a self-illusion. How can you identify a perfectionist? That may be another way of thinking about it. So, what would you do in order to answer that question? Well, you could look at, what do perfectionists actually do? But that's not that helpful, because what a perfectionist does is very much the same as what other people are doing, including other high-performing people. So it's not simply a question of what one does. It's more a question of how one does it, the mode in which one does things, how much they do it. So it's the way in which things are done, and it's the degree or the amount. And that's different than just the sheer, facticity of something being done. Those are external things that you can look at, having to do with actions. If you're looking at yourself, or you're looking at other people, and we can't, see another person's soul in its entirety, or their mind, or their personality as an entire whole, but you can't do that with your own either. But we do have some degree of access to each other's psyches. That's what it means to have an interpersonal life with other human beings, to have what we call intersubjectivity in phenomenology. It's a fancy word for saying, well, we inhabit a common world in which we can actually peer into things to some degree. What would we talk about in that case? We could say, well, how does a perfectionist feel? What does that look like, or what can you sense coming from them? And you can sense it. at least in myself, not just through self-reflection, seeing how I feel about things, but I can tell sometimes through email interactions with a student that they have these perfectionist tendencies, and which direction they're going. You can sense the anxiety or the need for things to be very, very clear and the path to be charted out so that they can plow ahead and get it all done. You can also ask about motives. With a perfectionist, what is their actual motive? And you can say, well, to do something to the highest degree, to make it perfect, to be perfect in every way. But then, we have to clarify that, and I think it's worth thinking about what we mean by that. So another thing that we can look at, we've got these two dimensions of what does a perfectionist do? What's their motive behavior? What is their affect or their motive like? Their interior disposition. What don't they do? That's another important question to ask yourself. What separates a perfectionist from a non-perfectionist? It's not just what they do, it's also what they don't do, or what they don't have, or what they don't exhibit. And one of the things that goes along with that, I think, is, again, I'm drawing from my own experience and the experience of many others that I've interacted with, a kind of lack of contentment. Not necessarily an inability, but certainly a failure to appreciate what it is that one has actually attained. You look at perfectionists, and they often get quite a bit done, but they're not thrilled about what they got done, and they tend to focus on the lack, or the small failures, or the negativity of what they've gotten done, rather than on the positive achievement that they actually did something, rather than nothing. Oftentimes a perfectionist focuses too much on things that turn out to be irrelevant, so that keeps them from actually being able to focus on things that are more relevant, and that's a kind of privation or lack as well. And I would say that another thing that's really lacking in perfectionists, and again, I have to admit that this affects me as well, thankfully less than I used to, is what's often missing is a sense of proportion. And I don't mean just a sense of proportion about, individual things or instances or projects or things like that. And I don't mean that the person lacks a sense of proportion totally so that they can't get anything right. I mean that once they get involved with something that they value and which they think other people value, they tend to lose a sense about how important things actually are in relation to each other. So, for example, I'll give you an example. I just finished turning in grades for 2 classes of ethics students from this last semester. And I inevitably get some students emailing me who already have an A in the class, and they're concerned because they didn't get the full points on this thing or that thing or this thing. And now, why does that show a lack of proportion? Well, if what they're really concerned about is scores, it's not going to make any difference if they get, an extra 10 points here and an extra 10 points there. They've already got the A for the class. There are no A pluses at Marist, so, thank God for that, because otherwise I have people like grade grubbing for every little tiny little bit that they can get. And they pour. Now, what do we mean by a lack of proportion? Does that mean that that 10 points doesn't matter at all? No, it's 10 points, but it's not going to make any difference. And here's the key thing. They're throwing away time, energy, even to a certain extent, goodwill can be lost in the process as well, by insisting, I need to have an answer about this. And, myself, in the past, I have to admit that I would look at that and I'd get, indignant about it. Now I just kind of feel sorry for the person who gets into that sort of trap of perfectionism, where it doesn't make any difference. It would be sort of like washing a table, and there's still like one little speck on it, but nobody's ever going to eat on that table again, and the table's already been cleared. You don't need to do it any further than that. Another thing to ask, as long as we're raising these big questions about perfectionism, if we want to fully understand it, so we've got, what is the typical action, what is the typical affect or desire or emotion or motivation, what tends to be missing. You can add to that, who are they trying to please? And the perfectionist often doesn't really have a good handle on this. Again, I'm speaking from experience. In the process, you can ask them, well, who are you trying to please? And they'll be able to point to some sort of, standard or person who's evaluating them, or perhaps themselves. But it's not really thought through very well. And as soon as you start peeling it away, you find out that maybe they're trying to please somebody else. Maybe it's kind of amorphous. Maybe they have no idea who they're trying to please. There's just this sort of tyranny of standards self-imposing itself upon them. Who are they trying to impress? Who are they trying to satisfy? That's really worth thinking about. And this isn't the sort of thing that you can answer right off the bat. This is, if you are a perfectionist, this is the sort of thing that you kind of have to mull over, and you have to think about from situation to situation. Understanding these sorts of things is not just a matter of having one aha moment, an epiphany where everything comes into view. It's really, and this is, this is kind of typical of the problem with the perfectionist. The perfectionist would love for there to be something like that where everything clicks. But that's not the way it really works. That's not the way moral progress actually takes place for the most part for most people. What happens is you get a little bit of insight here, and you keep working at it and expanding it, and you get a little bit over here and keep working at it and expand it, and then maybe you bring those together, and then you get a little bit more here, and you just start changing some of your habits and pay close attention to what you think and how you treat yourself, and how you make some resolutions about what you're going to do next time, and you fail in half of those, and then you just evaluate why you failed in those, and then actually start congratulating yourself for the ones where you didn't, and gradually you start making some progress. Well, figuring out these questions like who are you really trying to impress or please or satisfy, if you're a perfectionist, is kind of like that. The other thing that you can ask that's really important is what are the results of being a perfectionist? And this is where, this is really the handle by which you might actually get a grip on it and decide you want to investigate it or even change it. The perfectionist does not actually bring about what it is that they aim at. It doesn't really work out the way that they want to, even when everything turns out to be quite good. What are the results? Well, they sort of misinvest time and energy, enthusiasm, effort, and that means that they got to take it away from somewhere else. You only get 24 hours in a day, so if you're spending an extra 2 hours on some sort of project that really didn't bear, that, you've got to take those 2 hours from somewhere else. If you only have so much energy, you can boost it a little bit by drinking yourself some coffee, but that's a, there's a diminishing return on that. That's not going to carry you through all the time. What are some other results? Well, perfectionism, it's not just what you end up doing or what you end up leaving out. It's also the dissatisfaction that you end up feeling yourself. Many of my students who are perfectionists talk in terms of anxiety, being anxious about say grades, for example, or about doing well in the class. Some of them, even are concerned about how I view them. They turn in an assignment late, and they don't want me to think of them as the kind of person who turns in an assignment late. And I'll write them and I'll say, I understand life is complicated. Sometimes things fall through the cracks. We forget things. That's why I set things up so you can still turn in your assignments late. And generally I actually, give them, if not full credit, pretty close to it, because I want them to actually do the work that's involved. And they're less focused quite often on why I want them to do the work, which is the big picture. That's the student learning, right? And they're more focused on, I got to get this done. I got to get this done. Oh God, I hope I didn't screw it up, and I did it the right way. And Dr. Sadler doesn't think bad of me for turning it in late, and I'll never let this happen again. And they get wound up into this sort of thing. For me, I have something like that when it comes to time. I don't like being late for anything. And I feel bad, sometimes when I'm late to, say, grade student stuff. I try to get that turned around as quickly as possible so that students have their work right away. And I actually, I feel bad when I don't, but I've at least gotten to the point where I recognize, hey, that's going to happen from time to time. For me, the perfectionism tends to exhibit itself more in the kind of work and research and writing and course development that I do. I try to make my courses to be the best they can possibly be for the students, so I'm constantly adding new resources and developing handouts and shooting videos, like for instance this talking about perfectionism. And the question is, for you, how much time are you going to put into this, and how good does it have to be? Does it, with videos, for example, do I need to have like an intro thing with some music, do I need to annotate everything so that, somebody could follow each idea out, with written stuff as well as, me talking? At a certain point, if you want to get out of being a perfectionist, you have to train yourself to say, that's good enough. And that's really scary for a perfectionist, because one of the reasons why somebody is a perfectionist is because they are not very good at identifying what actually is good enough. And part of that has to do with, this question of who are you actually trying to please. If you've had to try to please people for whom nothing was ever good enough, or, I've known people, for example, who, when they did well, then it was sort of a neutral response, and then anything less than that got a you did badly response. If that's the case, you're going to have a very difficult time figuring out what actually is good enough, particularly in determinate circumstances. You're going to look actually for some sort of standard for what's good enough, rather than developing the prudence that's required within you to be able to say, yeah, in this circumstance, this counts as good enough. In this circumstance, this counts as good enough. And they're not always exactly the same. So, we've covered a lot of ground. I want to say a few other things. One is that perfect is a relative term. And there's one exception to this, and that's if you have a certain kind of ontology or metaphysics which actually thinks that there is a perfect being out there, or something like degrees of being where there's some sort of thing at the apex, and that is not us human beings, if you actually have a metaphysics like that. Somebody like that would be, say, for example, Plato, or St. Anselm, or St. Thomas Aquinas, people who believed in, if not the God of Judaism, Christianity, these monotheistic religions, the form of the good, or something like that, some sort of ontological principle of perfection that would be the apex, and that we would in some way participate in. There we're talking very metaphysical stuff. We're not talking about the everyday phenomenal world that we move in and experience, and in which we act like perfectionists. So let's think about other meanings of perfect, where it is relative. So, one sense of the word perfect is when you satisfy some sort of standard. So I give an exam, and it's got, say, multiple choice questions and fill in the blank questions, and then some short answer questions, some essay questions, and the exam is worth 100 points, and if you answer everything completely correctly, you have a perfect score. Now, that score is a proxy. It doesn't necessarily mean you have perfect knowledge, right? You have a score that's perfect in relation to the set of standards that's been provided you. And we can do this for artificial things. You know, you can talk about, I don't know, I mean, can you talk about, say, the perfect size for a book? I don't know. There probably isn't one. It's going to depend on a lot of circumstances. You know, is this book the perfect size? Is this book the perfect size? This book is, you know, a pocket book, so, you know, it fit into certain pockets, but not all of them. And, you know, you got to ask yourself, who sets these standards, and how important are these standards? A lot of times people get so caught up into, I need some standards. I need something that I can measure up to. I gotta figure out what my, you know, what I have to do in this case, and they don't ask themselves, well, what's the actual point here? Is it to find, you know, the standards, get on the dean's list? How do you get on the dean's list? You got to get a certain grade point average. Well, you know, is that really that important? It's not, actually. I knew people who obsessed over it. I have to admit, I did to some degree. I was interested in somewhat bigger things as well, like graduating, you know, summa cum laude when I was an undergraduate. Or, you know, when I took my preliminary examinations, I remember how humiliating it was that on my master's examination, I got a low pass, in part over some kind of, you know, BS things, you know, some criticisms that probably were off base. And then how, you know, great I felt when I got high passes on 3 out of 4 of my preliminary examinations at the master's level. But, you know, when it comes down to it, does that really mean anything? Not much. Not in the long run. I mean, these are not great predictors of how you're going to do in the future. You can get an A on one of my ethics exams, and then, you know, you've managed to remember all that stuff for the test, then you forget it the next day and it doesn't make any impact on your life. Or you can be the kind of person who actually gets a 75, but you retain the stuff because you actually cared about it and you thought about it and you made it part of your new existence. And the person who's actually successful is not the one who got the 100. The person who's successful is the one who carried it forward. So, you know, simply satisfying standards, having perfect scores is it's not really perfection in a real sense. Are there any other senses that are more meaningful? You can say not lacking it, not having any sort of blemish, not lacking any sort of thing that it ought to have. Like, you know, is this a perfect pen? Well, it's not perfect anymore because, you know, it's not completely full. So I guess it was perfect when it was first created. And I guess if we looked at some of these things, we'd find, you know, pits and blemishes and stuff like that. That's not a particularly useful way of understanding perfection either. I know that that's one that we use. You know, you can talk about somebody having a perfect body. Get close enough to any body, and it turns out not to be perfect. I mean, the HDTV has been great for showing us that. Suddenly all these people who were TV worthy before turn out to have all these, you know, facial blemishes that we didn't realize they had. Are there any other meanings that could be useful? Well, you know, you can say best in relation to certain things. So you have the highest score up until this point. You're perfect. And the perfectionist might be aiming at that, just surpassing everybody else. I know that tended to be the kind of perfectionism that I really had a problem with in the past, and I guess still probably have some problem with in certain respects in the present. You know, if you're involving yourself in a lot of comparison to others, sometimes that takes away from actually focusing on what you yourself are doing. I would like to say that if we want to get away from perfectionism, we need a different conception of perfection. And I would say that if you want to find where that better conception of it lies, it's actually in ancient and medieval philosophy. It's not lacking any blemish or anything like that. It's tied to an understanding of something as being perfect when it's the way it ought to be, when it's fulfilling its purpose, when it's realizing its potential. And that's, that's a matter of degrees, and something can be, in a certain sense, perfect without being entirely developed, being completely at its end. If you think about a plant, for example, we'll take corn. Everyone wants to use an acorn and an oak, and I'm kind of tired of that example. We'll take corn because I'm from corn growing areas, so I know a lot about corn. You put it in the furrows, and it pops up, and it's shooting up, and you don't expect it to be 8 feet tall immediately, right? I mean, knee high by the 4th of July is the old saying. Although the new stuff shoots up a lot quicker than that because it's all genetically modified. But if it's knee high by the 4th of July, you're on good track. That's sort of a measure that we used in the Midwest for corn. It's got to shoot up, and it's got to produce these tassels, and then it's got to produce ears, and the ears have to have at least a certain size of kernels, and then then it's perfect. It's done what it ought to do. And it's the same way with you. For so many things, you don't have to find some sort of somebody else given artificial standard that tells you, okay, here's where you have to be. This is exactly what you have to be. See whether the things that you're doing are actually working out. Adopt a more pragmatic conception of perfection. One, though, that's in line with ancient and medieval thought, which saw us as being part of a cosmos in which each thing had its own way of developing. And, Thomas Aquinas, for example, said, the nature of a thing, you only get to see the nature of a thing fully when it's been fully developed. So, and he gives examples like a horse. Well, horses aren't that tough to figure out. But a human being is so much more complicated, let alone a house or a family. A family can be thought of as something that undergoes development. People try to have these perfect families, and sometimes they're just hellish because they misunderstand perfection. And perfectionism is really a misunderstanding of the nature of perfection. So the last thing I'm going to talk about are a few paradoxes of perfectionism. And again, things that I know through bitter experience. And had to work my own way through it. And I can do another video talking about some of the specifics of that some other time. Here's one paradox. Perfectionism is an adaptation to one's environment, to one's history, to one's the conditions that one lives in. That's actually maladaptive. So it's an adaptation to change oneself into something that is producing, attaining certain things, but is actually maladaptive because you're missing out on things, and you're cutting yourself short from some satisfaction for yourself. Most perfectionists are not happy people. Here's another paradox. It involves so much energy and attention that it keeps the person from noticing all the other things that are going on and from reflecting on them. So, perfection for a human being would involve growth. Perfectionism actually stifles growth because it produces a sort of building in a kind of way, but it keeps you from actually expanding and growing because it keeps you from paying attention to the larger universe and the matrix of other human beings that you're caught up with. It keeps you from actually knowing yourself, and that way it sort of hinders your own growth. Another paradox is that it prevents a person who has it from developing the prudence that's actually needed to determine what counts as good enough and what would actually count as genuinely perfect. Prudence is not something that you're born with. It's something that you have to develop and cultivate over time. And it doesn't happen in everybody. Sometimes it takes bitter experience and humiliation and screwing up and then, reflecting on that and trying to get your life on track. I know I've got a lot of cases like that for myself where it's through sorrow and suffering that I wound up learning some things that other people were telling me, but I wasn't paying attention. Sometimes it's through having, good people that you actually learn from and model yourself after and listen to, and who genuinely care for you and who can help you to understand what actually counts as good enough and which direction you should be going. And that scores by themselves are really not that important. They're not the thing that you can nourish yourself with. So anyway, prudence, that's something that the perfectionist unfortunately lacks, and yet they think that they're one of the most prudent people in the world quite often. The most prudent thing is, if you're a perfectionist, is to actually realize that you're a perfectionist and then to start working on getting away from that. The last thing, and this is probably the most important thing, this is the reason why perfectionism is a failing strategy for dealing with life, for dealing with the kind of things that you have to do in life. Anything that's valuable in the world, in life, in yourself is complicated, because reality is complicated. And when things are complicated, that means that you can see them from multiple angles, from multiple sides. And what counts as perfect from one vantage point, you change the vantage point a little bit, and now you can see the blemishes and the imperfections involved. The last thing I'm going to say about perfectionism, really it ties everything else in together, and it's something that's really important to keep in mind. And it has to do with the nature of reality and the things that we find valuable. So, here's the bottom line. Anything that is actually worthwhile, valuable, out in the world, in your relations with other people, in yourself, in the things that you produce, anything along those lines is always going to be complex. And it's usually going to be more complex than you're taking in at any given point, and it's always going to be more complex than any particular measure of it that you're engaging in. So you might think of it this way. Everything has multiple sides. For instance, this pen, you can see it from different angles, right? And you can see it in multiple ways. It looks very different in this way when you want to go right with it than when you do this. Just a simple thing, but you've already changed the perspective on it. You've changed the nature of it. I break off this piece right here, and now it won't cling to my pocket. That changes the perspective as well. Coffee mug, if it's full of coffee, that's good. The coffee's not hot necessarily, well then that's not so good. So anything that you look at, anything that you're going to evaluate and try to make perfect, as soon as you change your perspective, the imperfections show up. And what that should make you think about is the fact that the goal is not to try to maximize perfection, because you can never do it. You can never, no matter if even you just pick one single thing, one single aspect about yourself, you can't take that and make that from every single perspective one might look at it into something absolutely perfect. In part because, what if you put it next to something else? Or what if you put it in the context of your whole life? And you say, I invested half my life into this one thing. That's a failed life, most likely, unless that was some really, really important thing. And if it was, you probably didn't make it perfect yourself. You were probably collaborating with other people, and it probably still isn't perfect. Anyway, so, the thing that you want to do is start thinking less in terms of, you might say, artificially imposed and unthought about, just assumed standards of perfection, and start actually thinking about what do I mean when I say I want things to be perfect, when I want myself to be perfect. What is my conception of perfection? Do I have the right conception of perfection? Because, see, that's one of the paradoxes of perfectionism. Perfectionism gets perfection wrong. and is thereby imperfect. So that's where I'll leave off. A lot of reflections on this, but it's something really important, something that I've had to struggle with a lot myself, and anybody that this helps out there in thinking about these things, I'm glad if it helps you. If not, maybe you wasted 20 minutes of your time, but unless you're a perfectionist, maybe that's not such a bad thing.